in the complexity of urban life, people are more guarded. It's more difficult to form relationships. And it seemed to me that we needed to find ways to get inside the homes of people who had all sorts of barriers protecting them from the gospel. And it seemed to me that Lewis was someone who had found a way to reach people through his writing. And it seemed to me that stories, whether written or through movies or television, would be an important element in an overall strategy of evangelism, not as though that's the silver bullet, but it needs to be a piece of our thinking.
C.S. Lewis is one of the most beloved Christian authors in history. Generations of children have been shaped by his Chronicles of Narnia, and countless adults have had their faith bolstered by his most famous apologetic work, Mere Christianity. And yet, there was more to Lewis's life and thought than many of his appreciative readers know. A prolific writer, and yet quite private, Lewis's life is often viewed through the lens of his most famous works, an approach that misses fascinating details about his early formative years, his own personal faith, and his closest relationships. In our interview today, I'm talking with Harry Lee Poe, who serves as the Charles Colson University Professor of Faith and Culture at Union University, and who's also the author of The Making of C.S. Lewis from Crossway. Let's get started. Well, Hal, thank you so much for joining me today on the Crossway Podcast.
Thanks, Matt. It's good to be with you.
So as I was doing some research to prepare for this interview, I read that you're distantly related to the famous poet Edgar Allan Poe, and I saw just a minute ago, our listeners won't know this, but I saw that you had a Edgar Allan Poe mug that you were drinking from. So I'm assuming that's true.
It is. He was my great-great-grandfather's cousin, and for 10 years I served as the president of the Poe Museum in Richmond, Virginia, where Poe grew up, and have written several books about Poe and his spiritual journey. Most people don't realize that he came to faith about 6 weeks before he died.
Wow.
And that's another remarkable story, but it's virtually the same kind of conversion story as C.S. Lewis. The difference being that Lewis wrote all of his memorable works after his conversion, and Poe didn't write anything after his.
That's what I was going to ask you about. I had read in an interview somewhere that you did that you did see some very interesting parallels between those two men. And so, I wondered if you could just briefly share a little bit more. What is it about their stories that is so similar? I think in our minds, they feel like very, very different figures.
They do seem like different figures on the surface, but remember that Lewis loved science fiction, and that Poe is the one who actually is the father of science fiction. And for the same reason, Poe was exploring spiritual questions that finally culminated in 1848 with his cosmological treatise on the universe, in which he concluded that there must be a God who exists. But he was asking a number of questions, the same question Lewis was asking: if there's just a brute materialistic universe, and that's where Lewis was in 1917 after studying with W.T. Kirkpatrick. There's just a brute material universe, no God, no spiritual reality. If that's the case, then why do we have a sense of right and wrong? In just a brute universe, nothing is right or wrong. There's just what is. There's nothing beautiful or ugly. There's just what is. And so, just as these questions bothered Lewis, they bothered Poe. Poe also invented the mystery story. And the trick to the mystery story is it only works if the audience brings to the story the idea of justice, of right and wrong. And the audience has to care about the truth. And so here are all these ultimate values, universal values, that should not exist unless there's something other than the material world. And so Poe was toying with all of those ideas throughout the 1840s, just as Lewis was toying with them in the 1920s. So that's the first chapter to Lewis's Mere Christianity, right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. And his moral argument for the existence of God.
What was it that first got you into C.S. Lewis, and not just in a cursory, reading some of his best-known works, but you've really spent a lot of your life studying Lewis, teaching Lewis to students. What pulled you in first?
What pulled me into Lewis, in 1977, I was a seminary student, and the provost of the seminary took a group of students to New York City on a ministry plunge, just to experience the city and see what was the state of ministry in New York City. And as a born and bred Southerner, of course, I knew that I would hate New York, but I loved it. Absolutely fascinated and thrilled by the city. And we were standing on the street corner, and Dr. Bennett said, there are 40,000 people who live within a block of us. And there was a guard standing at every door to every high-rise. And I thought, how in the world do they hear the gospel? And I realized that the traditional means of doing evangelism in South Carolina and Kentucky and Tennessee wasn't going to be effective in New York City simply because you don't have access to the people.
So how would you describe that traditional means?
Oh, well, the traditional means it's in a small culture. You come in contact with everybody in the community in the course of a year, and you talk, and you can have conversation, and you invite them to church, and that sort of thing. It's very interpersonal, very relational approach to evangelism, the personal testimony, and just attending to people. So very, very Jerusalem, second chapter of Acts kind of evangelism.
Yeah.
But in the complexity of urban life, people are more guarded. It's more difficult to form relationships. And it seemed to me that we needed to find ways to get inside the homes of people who had all sorts of barriers protecting them from the gospel.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that Lewis was someone who had found a way to reach people through his writing. And it seemed to me that stories, whether written or through movies or television, would be an important element in an overall strategy of evangelism, not as though that's the silver bullet, but it needs to be a piece of our thinking. And so I got interested in what Lewis was doing. And of course, Lewis was a visionary. He was seeing ahead decades. When he wrote The Abolition of Man and gave those lectures during World War II, he was foreseeing post-Christian society decades later. He was seeing our world. He describes our world in that series of lectures. And so I saw him as a valuable resource. Now, I never thought of myself as a C.S. Lewis scholar because I was doing other things. I was interested in evangelism and some of the barriers to evangelism, so I've done major work in science and religion. A lot of my publishing is in that area. And I'm concerned with the project we used to call the integration of faith and learning. How does an English professor or a physics professor or a political science professor teach from a Christian perspective? And it seemed to me that Lewis understood that and did that. He said that the best kind of apologetics is not more little books about Christianity, but more little books by Christians on every subject with their Christianity latent.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the key to the integration of faith and learning. You first have to understand in what way your discipline intersects with the gospel. So that's been a major part of my work. But again, Lewis was very helpful in thinking through how to do that. So I had written a number of books before I first wrote a book about Lewis, and I realized that Lewis figures prominently in all of these books about subjects other than C.S. Lewis. So that was how I got interested in him, and his own concern for the evangelization of England.
Yeah. So you talked about how this interest in evangelism and apologetics for you was what initially led you to pay attention to Lewis, and I think that's probably how a lot of us know Lewis from books like Mere Christianity. He was this apologist. But I guess one question I have, would he have viewed himself, did he describe himself as an apologist, or was that just kind of a side thing that he's now really well known for?
Yeah, there's, the old line from Twelfth Night, Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, that's you can modify and say, some are born apologists, some achieve apologetics, and some have apologetics thrust upon them. To a great extent, Lewis had apologetics thrust upon him. His most famous books that we think of as apologetics, such as Problem of Pain, Mere Christianity, Miracles, were not books that Lewis himself intended to write. He was not planning on writing The Problem of Pain, but he was approached by the publisher, and they asked him to do it, and he did it out of a sense of duty as part of his war work. Same with Mere Christianity, which originally a series of 4 different radio series broadcasts during the war. He was asked by the BBC to do each of those 4, and he agreed to do it as part of his war work. He had training in philosophy as an undergraduate. Then he went on and did a second degree and wound up being an English professor. So he knew how to think logically, and he had thought through these matters. So he agreed to do it, but he didn't think of himself as an apologist. He thought of himself as a literary critic, an expert in medieval and Renaissance literature, who happened to do apologetic work on the side.
Yeah. So what did he make of the success of Mere Christianity as after the addresses were been published as a book?
Oh, it was a two-edged sword. He was gratified, of course, that people were buying it and reading it, and it seemed to be making a difference. But he hated it because people were writing to him, and it was taking up all of his time every day, writing letters in reply to questions people had. He was writing 30 and 40 letters a day for years. And it was a huge burden. He commented on it a number of times in letters to friends that he couldn't write to his friends because he had to write all of these letters to strangers. And he just wanted it to all go away.
Yeah. So obviously then, evangelical Christians, we love C.S. Lewis, right? We've all, many of us, most of us have read something that he's written, whether it's Mere Christianity or The Problem of Pain or his Narnia series, beloved books. But I've still heard some people say that Lewis likely wouldn't consider himself an evangelical today if he were alive. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. What do you think? Do you think there's truth in that? Are there differences that Lewis would have with what we would consider to be evangelicalism that would be pretty stark?
Yes. Well, what we mean by evangelicalism in the United States and what is meant by evangelicalism in Great Britain are a little bit different. And in the United States, evangelicals tend to ally politically to the right. In Britain, historically, evangelicals have tended to be politically involved to the left, and that goes back to Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery, Prime Minister Gladstone was famous evangelical, but of course interested in social reform and that sort of thing. So you've got sort of a split in the early 20th century over American evangelicals going a different way for different reasons, just the social context. But now in terms of what evangelicals ought to be, the way that we ought to be identifying ourselves, evangel, the gospel, Lewis was very much concerned with the gospel, the core gospel message, and not confusing it with ecclesiology or theological systems or politics, but having a clear understanding of what is the Christian faith rather than what we might add on to it. And he talks about Christianity and other things in the Screwtape letters. And Uncle Screwtape wants Wormwood's patient to adopt a Christianity and something else mode, which is always dangerous. So Lewis wanted to avoid that. And one of the most famous American preachers of the last century wasn't an American, he was English, Stephen Olford. But he moved to this country after the Second World War. He was a pastor in New York City. He was a model preacher that for several generations, American evangelical preachers modeled themselves on Stephen Olford, a great pulpiteer and a great evangelist. He encouraged Billy Graham early on, and Graham in some ways modeled his preaching on Stephen Olford. But here's the kicker. Lewis, in one of his essays, said it would make a good team if you had one person deal with the intellectual issues people might have with the Christian faith, those barriers to faith, and then have an evangelist preach a gospel message and call for a response. Well, that wasn't a theoretical idea. Lewis actually did that with Stephen Olford in London at Westminster Hall, which is the huge Methodist meeting house across the street from Westminster Abbey. And he did that a number of times after World War II. So, yeah, in a technical sense, he's not an American evangelical, but he shares the concerns of evangelicals.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think there's some
His view of, let me just add another thing. His view of the Bible would be an important part of that, is the Bible as revelation, as definitive, as normal of determining Christian faith and practice. So a high view of Scripture and the need for conversion.
Are there any things that you think the average American evangelical who loves his Chronicles of Narnia, who has read Mere Christianity and maybe the Screwtape letters, would be surprised to learn about Lewis if they were to dig into some of his other less well-known writings, or maybe some of his correspondence, where we get a little bit more of an inside look on who he was?
Oh, goodness. Well, he himself said that he was criticized by the Baptists for drinking and smoking, and I'm a Baptist, and I don't drink or smoke, so but I realize that some fine Christians do, and that's not a bar to communion, but I'm sure there would be surprises. I think you will find surprises in the book, but I primarily find Lewis edifying. I don't venerate Lewis. He had his shortcomings, like all of us. And one of the things I like about him is the transparency of his shortcomings, because this is what he talks about in the Screwtape letters and in The Great Divorce. When he talks about the temptations we have in life, he's not doing research or theoretical theology. He's doing testimony. And Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, the Screwtape letters and the Great Divorce are all works of testimony. If you read his letters, you'll find him talking about these identical struggles that he then pictures in different forms as fiction in those books. But so he's pretty transparent. He's often referred to as being very secretive and private. Well, he's a typical Englishman in terms of not bearing his heart on his shoulder, but he talks about it all in his letters to different people.
Yeah.
Not everything to everybody. One of the comments about Jesus in John's Gospel is that he didn't open himself up to everybody because not everybody's to be trusted. You got to be careful about that sort of thing.
Yeah. I remember reading somewhere that going back to that the Screwtape letters and the way that was in some ways autobiography for him, that he really didn't enjoy the process of writing that book, and that it ended up being a very unpleasant experience for him. Is that true? Is that attested somewhere?
Because he learned a trick about getting points across, and it was to look at something from the other way around. You'll find him mentioning that a number of times. He first started doing that when he was writing to his friend Arthur Greaves when he was a teenager, living in England, and Arthur was back home in Ireland. And Arthur was a bit thick, and so Lewis had to think of ways to explain difficult ideas to him. And he said, "No, Arthur, think about it from the other way around." And so that's what he's doing with the Screwtape letters, looking at temptation from the perspective of Satan and his minions. And to do that, Lewis had to think diabolically. And he said it was a great spiritual strain, as though he were getting inside the head of Satan. And I think one of the problems is it's a fairly easy thing to do.
Yeah.
He talked about this in terms of Paradise Lost. And he wrote really the great work on Paradise Lost in the early 1940s. His friend Charles Williams had given a lecture on Paradise Lost, and Lewis said, "Oh my goodness, I need to do that." So he dusted off his Paradise Lost and gave a series of university lectures, and then published the book, A Preface to Paradise Lost. It's still in print. And anyone who's working on Paradise Lost today, they still have to refer to Lewis. They may not agree with Lewis, and many people disagree with Lewis, but he sort of set the gold standard for it, and you have to deal with him. But here's what he said about Dryden's idea that Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost, the great anti-hero, because he's bold and exerting his freedom, and he's his own man, and he's the hero. And Lewis said that's just absolute rot. The very idea that Milton would have regarded Satan as a hero is just ridiculous. And the great line of Satan in Paradise Lost is, better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. And, that's a flip of the psalm, better to be a gatekeeper in the house of the Lord than to dwell in the tents of iniquity. And Lewis said the thing you have to remember about Satan is he's an ass, and he's to be ridiculed. In Paradise Lost, Milton is making fun of him for making such a foolish decision to rebel against the Lord of glory that he knew? How foolish. But then Lewis had to deal with, why is Satan such a well-drawn character in Paradise Lost? And Lewis said, this is the problem with literature. Our villains are often our most well-drawn characters because it's pretty easy to imagine being worse than we are. We all have thoughts that we never act upon.
Yeah.
We keep them inside us, but we all have these diabolical thoughts from time to time. Not all the time, and it isn't necessarily the way we are, but these thoughts pass through our heads of doing something that really is imaginable. It's not unimaginable. We really can imagine doing it. And Lewis says, for that reason, it's pretty easy to draw a really diabolical figure, but it's impossible for us to imagine someone better than we are. We don't have a frame of reference for knowing what it is to be better than we are. And so often in literature, the really good character is just a little thin.
Yeah.
And so what Lewis was having to do, and why it was a spiritual strain, he was having to think like Satan thinks in tempting people.
Well, and that then is a nice segue into the Chronicles of Narnia, where we have probably the dominant character that we all think of when we think of Narnia is Aslan, this lion figure. And one thing I was reading a little bit about Narnia, and I think the default assumption is that, when we think of the Chronicles of Narnia, that would probably stand in many of our minds as one of the best examples of Christian allegory ever written. And we can kind of see certain characters like Aslan as pretty clearly mapping onto Jesus as an allegory for the greatest man. And yet I read somewhere that Lewis actually rejected that label. He didn't really view his Narnia books as allegory specifically. Is there any truth behind that?
Yes, and it has to do with the technical definition of allegory. So he wrote the Allegory of Love, which is the definitive treatment of allegory from the classical period up through the time of Shakespeare. 1,500 years, it was the dominant form of literature. And if you had said Aslan is a metaphor for Christ or symbolizes Christ, Lewis would say, oh yes, that's what it's about, completely. But it's not an allegory, because an allegory technically is a personification of a quality. So the Statue of Liberty is a physical personification of the quality of freedom and liberty. Aslan is a representative of Jesus, who is not a quality or an idea or a concept. He's a person. So in a technical sense, the Chronicles of Narnia are not an allegory, but they are representative of the Christian story. And Lewis insisted on that a number of times. He wrote a number of letters to children in which he explained how Aslan is representative or symbolic of Jesus.
Yeah. When he started the Chronicles of Narnia, did he have the whole story mapped out and all the different characters and all the different major events that were going to happen, or did it grow organically over time?
Yeah, it grew. He only had the one story in mind, and he first envisioned the story as a picture in his mind when he was 16 years old, living in Great Bookham, studying with W.T. Kirkpatrick. Lewis loved the winter. He adored the snow and the cold and the wind. He just thought it was fabulous. And so they were having a dreadful winter. And he imagined, he had the picture in his mind of a faun walking through the snow with paper packages and an umbrella. So that was when he was 16. And it was years later that he finally sat down in 1948 and started sketching out the story. And he didn't have Aslan in mind at all. He said Aslan just suddenly came bounding into the story, and he was as surprised as the children were that there was Aslan. So he only had the one story. But then he thought of a second story, and he thought, well, that'll be it. But then he thought of a third story, and he said, well, that's it for sure, no more. But then he thought of a fourth one, and so he mentions this in another letter. How he came to write them. So, but no, he did not have an overall scheme, and only in retrospect he wrote a creation story. Almost toward the end of the series. So it grew organically.
Yeah. So we've talked about how he expressed a level of discomfort and displeasure, but also a certain ease that came with writing from the from the perspective of the demons in the Screwtape letters. Did he ever talk about what it was like to write Aslan then in these stories as this Christ figure?
Yeah, I think that came quite easily. He wrote these stories quickly. Only a couple of them did he bog down. He bogged down on the magician's nephew. And I've got my own thoughts about that. He didn't say why he was bogging down, but that's the story about him as a little boy with his mother dying. And it was at the same time that he was writing Surprised by Joy. So he was doing both of those at the same time, and writing English literature in the 16th century.
And Surprised by Joy is his kind of spiritual autobiography.
It's his spiritual autobiography that focuses on his younger years, his life before he was 30. And the majority of it is his life before he was 18. So that may be why he bogged down. And he reworked it from his original start. But otherwise, they went very quickly, and which annoyed his friend Tolkien, who just writing was hard for Tolkien. It was easy for Lewis.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into that then. His early years. I think those who are familiar with Lewis will know that the basic outlines of his story. He was an atheist, and as a young man converted to Christianity, as we've already briefly discussed. But yeah, right in there, as a young boy, his mom died. I wonder if you could explain a little bit what happened there and what effect that had on him.
Yes, his mother died when he was 9 years old. She had cancer. And she had, as all mothers do, ambitions for her sons. And this was the Edwardian age. For her, their rise in society would depend upon speaking English as an Englishman. Now, they were Irish. They lived in Ireland, and they had Irish accents. Lewis and his brother Warnie often made fun of their father's accent, when in fact they had accents too, which they discovered when they were shipped off to boarding school in England. Now, this was what the mother insisted on, because there were schools they could have gone to in Ireland. But she knew that for them to really rise socially and professionally, they had to sound like an English gentleman.
Is that because there was prejudice against the
Irish?
Yes,
there was an enormous prejudice against the Irish in England. Now, I write about this in Becoming C.S. Lewis, the story of his first 18 years. And Lewis was the recipient of this prejudice. He and his brother were treated pretty brutally by both the headmaster and by the other boys at the school. They were shunned, and they were looked down on as inferiors. An accent marks a person out. You may, possibly, if you're a great linguist, be able to tell that I actually have a Southern accent. And when I was Dean for Academic Affairs at Bethel Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and some years ago, and the PR department was going to put out a press release and put a little article in the alumni magazine about me, and I was being interviewed by the staff writer, and when I mentioned that I'd studied some at Oxford, she said, "Oh, were you embarrassed to sound so ignorant?" And it's just a part of culture. We take note and we categorize people by accents. And Lewis's mother understood that. She knew that, and so for her, she obtained a solemn oath from Albert, her husband, that the boys would be educated in England. And so, though the boys pled and begged and did everything in the world to try to get free from English boarding school, he could not go back on his promise to his dead wife.
So did they end up getting away from that Irish accent? Was that kind of scrubbed away?
Oh yes, it was eventually scrubbed away, and there are hints of it. There are a few hints of it in the recordings we have of Lewis. We have a few recordings. The Four Loves. There's one episode of his radio broadcasts in during World War II that were recorded. There's a lecture on Pilgrim's Progress, one on Charles Williams, a bit of The Great Divorce. So we have a number of recordings. I discovered one myself, a lecture that he gave to the people of Iceland at the beginning of World War II. And so you can hear his voice, but it's what's known as Oxford English. It's a style of speaking almost unique to Oxford University, and it's what my mother-in-law would have called affected. It's learned and it's copied and it becomes the way you speak, but it's a bit artificial in terms of an English accent, and Lewis mastered it.
So then, what was the impact then of his mom dying when he was this young boy? Did that shape his life in significant ways?
Not apparently so, but in fact it did. Years later, in fact in the 1950s, in a letter he mentioned that this was really the beginning of his disenchantment with God. And that for him this gave birth to the problem of suffering, about which he wrote at the beginning of World War II, his book, The Problem of Pain. If there's a good, all-powerful, loving God, then why did my mother die of cancer? And so it's a huge issue, and he's one of those people who was equipped to deal with it. And he dealt with it in bookends. The first one was the intellectual problem. How do you think about that question? The problem of pain. But then years later, when his wife died, he wrote the other bookend, how does it feel? And that's a grief observed. And so you need to read both of those books together to get the full sense of Lewis's understanding of it. By the way, some people often think that his dark night of the soul over his wife's death lasted for years and years. He wrote The Grief Observed in a month. It's his diary of how he felt between her death at the end of July and about the third week of August. So it's not a long period of time. And by the end of his diary, he was coming out of it, and his head was clearing, and he was sorting it out. He never got over her death, but his spiritual travail was ended by the end of August.
Yeah. Did he, after he became a Christian and began to really dig into his faith, did his views on any, significant things change over the course of his life?
They did, in fact. And remember that the Greek word metanoia, which is translated repentance, means to change your mind. And so at the heart of the Christian faith is the need that we all have to constantly be changing our mind, because we've all been pretty well acculturated to the world before we get saved. And part of sanctification is the ongoing process of changing your mind. And so he did change his mind about many things. His friend Owen Barfield, who was not a Christian, said that I believe in evolution and never changed my mind about anything. And Lewis didn't believe in evolution, but he was constantly changing his mind. And he said it's funny because he said it as sort of a point of pride. I've never changed my mind about anything. And I think the thing to be proud of is that you are able to realize when you're wrong about something.
Yeah.
And you change your mind. A big one would be his attitude towards women, and the way he changed his mind about that. And he had a limited exposure to women growing up. No sisters. His mother was dead. Then he was in a male boarding school, and then in the army, and then in Oxford, where there were women, when he was there, weren't even able to take a degree. So he really didn't have much contact, and the women that he did have contact with weren't really the best representatives of the sex. Mrs. Moore, whom he took care of until she died in 1951, was not a woman who read widely. That would be the kind way to put it. You know those newspapers at the checkout counter of the grocery store? She would have read those, but that was about it. And completely self-obsessed, very selfish woman. And you find him writing about her and her friends in the Screwtape letters. So this was his exposure. But during the war, he began to meet some different kinds of women. Sister Penelope, the Anglican nun with whom he corresponded, Dorothy L. Sayers, the most formidable apologist in her own right and defender of the Christian faith, Ruth Pitter, the poet, a very fine poet, a much better poet than any of them in the Inklings, and Lewis began to turn to her for her critique of his poetry. He realized his friends were good sort, but they weren't poets. They couldn't help him with his poetry. So he's beginning to meet a number of women who can meet him on his own terms intellectually and are very clever, and their letters, their correspondence shows that. Brilliant, Sister Penelope, a brilliant patristic scholar and Greek scholar. And so he's having to rethink that, and then he meets Joy Davidman. Well, it's all over then. And he realizes, well, I guess it is possible for a woman and a man to be friends, and then that he just sort of melts. But a number of other things as well that he changed his mind about.
So you've been teaching courses on Lewis for, I think, over 15 years now, is what
about 20 years, I think.
20 years now. Is there a work of his that you just find yourself returning to over and over again?
Oh, goodness. Well, I turn to him every semester. But I think the one that surprised me most was The Allegory of Love. The Allegory of Love was his scholarly work that made him a formidable figure in the academic world. He started writing it in the mid-1920s. He published it in 1936. So it was a long time coming. But it is again, a great literary critical work still in print. And for your listeners, an academic book will get published with maybe 1,500, 2,000 copies. Crossway does a few academic books. It's a contribution to the scholarship. But if you're lucky, you'll have 3,000 copies, and it stays in print for about 3 years, and then it goes out of print, and it's never seen again. And that's what Lewis expected of his books, because that's what happened to everybody. They'll be in print, you'll sell a few thousand copies, and that's it. And he always feared being poor. Well, his books just don't go out of print. So, but the reason that Allegory of Love is so important for me is, as you go through it, you realize, oh my goodness, this is really the only book C.S. Lewis ever wrote, because all the others are overflow from the Allegory of Love. So his setting the Chronicles of Narnia in a certain age that are characterized by certain knightly courtesy is exemplified in Reapy Cheap. This is from the Allegory of Love, straight out of the Allegory of Love. The big thing that Lewis loved, and I write about this in Becoming C.S. Lewis, as a teenager, he fell in love with the journey story, where you go there and back again. And it's the story of Mallory's quests in the Morte de l'Auteur. It's Spenser's Fairy Queen. But then it's Fantasties by George MacDonald. And it's William Morris's stories about the journey to the end of the world for the great thing and how you're changed in the course of the journey. And so in the Allegory of Love, Lewis explores why this is such a compelling story, the journey story. And you begin to realize, oh my goodness, the journey story is the plot for the 3 science fiction stories, all 7 of the Narnia stories, as well as the Great Divorce. It's the journey there and back again. And I argue in The Making of C.S. Lewis that Lewis actually is the one who influenced Tolkien to write a journey story when he wrote The Hobbit and when he wrote The Lord of the Rings, because this wasn't the kind of story that Tolkien normally told. Tolkien liked the old Norse sagas where you go there and you die, and there's no happy ending. It's death, destruction, disaster, devastation, desolation. And yet, with The Hobbit, it's there and back again.
Right, that's the subtitle.
The story. Yeah, that's the story that Lewis loved and wrote about in The Allegory of Love.
So what evidence then do you have that it was Lewis who kind of pushed Tolkien to actually try that out?
That Lewis was writing The Allegory of Love when Tolkien was writing The Hobbit, and that Tolkien stalled. And this often happened with Tolkien. He got the story started, but he didn't know what it was about, and he didn't know where it was going. So you've got Lewis loving this story and always writing about it. Tolkien liking a different kind of story. If you read the Silmarillion and all the other stories that Tolkien was writing up to that point, they're just, gosh, awful. I mean, they're magnificent, but there's no happy ending.
Yeah.
Everything ends in disaster. There's no journey back again because you're destroyed. It's the Beowulf story, where Beowulf goes to fight knowing he's going to die. And that's the kind of story that Tolkien was writing. And Lewis liked a more cheerful ending, where somebody's changed in the course of the journey. And people are never changed in the course of the Silmarillion, but Bilbo is changed in the course of The Hobbit. So that's my argument.
Yeah, wow. Do we know that Lewis did he read, drafts of The Hobbit?
Oh, yes. They met every Monday morning at the Eastgate Hotel. There's so much talk about the Eagle and Child, but the Eagle and Child wasn't where people talked about their writing.
That was the pub, right?
That was a pub. And but it was the Eastgate Hotel pub, where Lewis and Tolkien met every Monday morning for several decades and worked through The Hobbit and the science fiction stories and The Lord of the Rings. And I think Lewis had a huge impact on the plot.
Yeah. Do we see that influence the other direction, where Tolkien was influencing anything that Lewis wrote?
Not in terms of plot, but Tolkien was horrified and accused Lewis of plagiarism for using one of Tolkien's words in his science fiction stories. So for the most part, Lewis avoided the possibility of offending Tolkien by by showing any influence
Yeah.
from him.
So he was seriously upset about that?
Oh yes, he was very seriously upset.
Huh. Did that change their friendship?
Well, I think yes, to a certain degree it did, because they become more distant. Then it was when that would have been in the middle of the war, and they just gradually grew apart. By 1948, when Lewis was writing the Chronicles, the first one, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Tolkien just hated it. Because Tolkien wanted his myths pure. That is, he wanted Norse myths, and those had to be separate from Greek myths. And the problem with that is Tolkien didn't understand, or doesn't seem to understand, the way that our culture draws on a number of different traditions. So we are influenced by the Bible. We're influenced by the Greek civilization. We're influenced by the Germanic and Norse cultures. And we have our own mythologies, and Father Christmas is part of the mythology of little children. And so for Lewis to put Father Christmas in there is, of course, it's what you do, because that's what our culture thinks about, and we blend them all together. Our children hear all of those stories.
Yeah.
So they are not purists or philologists. They're children who listen to stories. So Lewis had an entirely different view of it than Tolkien. Tolkien was thinking of it from the point of view of scholarship, and Lewis was thinking of it from the point of view of storytelling.
Yeah, right. You mentioned The Allegory of Love as a book that you like to return to, that you feel drawn towards, but you also said it was somewhat academic in tone. I wonder, is there another Lewis work, maybe it is Allegory of Love, that is not often read by the average Christian reader who might love Lewis, but that you would say would be worth picking up and trying to dig into, something that's not as widely lauded as something like Mere Christianity or Screwtape Letters?
Well, I would go with his stories, because those were the things he most himself loved to write. My favorite of his science fiction is That Hideous Strength. Sort of like Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh loved stories, but he mainly loved stories about himself. And That Hideous Strength is set in a university setting. So
wow.
It's a story about me. But anyone who has ever had a job where there was any backbiting and skullduggery and inner ring going on needs to read That Hideous Strength. So that's one. The others, I would say, you need to read The Great Divorce. And remember, he's not giving a theology of heaven and hell. What he's really doing is exploring the nature of temptation.
Because that's the critique of the book, is that he's got this low, weird view of hell, right?
Yeah, and he expresses no view of hell in the book. He says it's imaginary. What he's discussing is the nature of temptation.
So if you could sit down with Lewis now, after years of teaching his works and thinking about him and his thinking and his life, is there a lingering question that's in your mind that you would love to ask him if you could?
Oh, goodness. I would want to explore with him the idea of imagination. In the 1920s, he was in a debate with Owen Barfield over the nature of imagination. And Barfield took the view that, and with his own religious understanding, the human race is evolving towards deity, and there is one cosmic imagination of which we all partake, and imagination is true, and therefore Barfield gave equal credence to all the Gnostic heresies as well as the Christian scriptures, and thought that the Christian scriptures were not definitive of of religion that we are still evolving in our understanding. So that's his understanding of imagination. Lewis was trying to figure out imagination and how it works. And, of course, at one level, it's the ability to create imaginary worlds. But at another level, it's the way science works. That science doesn't work, yes, it relies on empirical observation, but it's actually imagination that allows a scientist to see what is not there, recognize what has never been seen before, and see the future. That is, that discovery, that invention, whatever it is that lies ahead. So it's and also the idea that the imagination is that capacity created by God and implanted in us that is in fact the means by which we receive revelation from God and by which we have spiritual experience with God. And I'd like to talk about him because he never got around to writing the book.
Yeah.
He talked about it. He never had it quite finished, and I'd love to talk with him about it because it's something that fascinates me too.
Yeah. Well, Hal, thank you so much for spending some time with us today, helping us to better understand somebody that I'm sure we're all maybe fairly familiar with. He feels familiar to us, but nevertheless, there's so much there to learn and discover.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate having a chance to talk with you today.
That was Harry Lee Poe on the life of C.S. Lewis. For more, be sure to check out his book with Crossway, The Making of C.S. Lewis, available online or at your local Christian bookstore. For more interviews like this, subscribe to the Crossway Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review. That helps us spread the word about the show. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the truth of God's Word through publishing gospel-centered content. Visit us today at crossway.org.